fund kind of higher ed internships and research fellowships and things like that. And then, yeah, I've read about process tracing, and I guess I'm just interested in hearing how it works in practice.
Great, thanks, John.
Sarah,
Mary. Oh,
sorry.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Angeline.
Sorry, I just forgot to mention that we will be recording this session primarily for note-taking purposes, but there have also been a few network members who really wanted to join but had like conflicting schedules. So as most of you know, after an event like this, we always post a summary in the National Network Online community. And if there is a demand and request for it, we might have to post the recording as well. So just so that all of you know that. Sorry, Sarah.
No, thank you, Evangeline. I had also had it on my list to mention something very similar to that and forgot, so thank you. All right, so carrying on with introductions, Mary, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, I'm Mary West. I'm the National Research Coordinator for Algebra Project, Inc., which was part of is part of an emerging alliance. And I read about process tracing in the evaluation report by the Sparks ORS people, and I believe Terri was one of the authors of that. An evaluation of 25 coalitions around the country and how they were using collective impact theory. So I'm very interested to learn more.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Mary. Am I echoing? No. Okay, great. And Cindy, I think, are you on audio? Cindy, can you hear us? Do you want to introduce yourself? Cindy might just be on the computer, which is totally fine. Okay, and then I see a cell phone number, the 480 number. Do you want to unmute and introduce yourself? Okay, maybe they are.
Can you hear me now?
Oh yeah, hi.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Cindy Zeiker with Zeiker Research. I had a project called Early STEM Engagement for Minority Males through a network of minorities serving institutions that really piqued my interest in this call today. So I'm here from Zeiker Research, and I'm really interested in learning more about trace data from our presenter.
Great, thanks, Cindy. And I realized that when I introduced myself, I did not say what I'm interested in learning today, so I apologize. But I actually am very new to process tracing, and so I'm just interested in learning more about it and hearing all of the questions and insights that you all have and have to ask about process tracing. So that's why I am interested in this conversation today. And then really quick, Alyssa, did you want to unmute and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Alyssa Naeem. I'm with the Coordination Hub and at EDC, at Education Development Center. I'm pausing because I feel like I'm much of a novice on the topic of process tracing and curious to hear more from Terri, but also from those on the call. Maybe you may be doing process. I have a feeling that some of us may be doing process tracing and not calling it that. So I'm also interested in hearing more about that from others on the call.
Great, thanks, Alyssa. And Tracy, I don't know if you're able to unmute and introduce yourself too. Oh, we can't hear you.
I'll put it in the chat.
Oh, now we hear you. After you unmute.
You hear me now?
Yep.
Sorry. And also in the background is my son's third grade virtual learning. So I can mute it. No, it's okay. You want to mute it for a second? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Sorry. So hi, I'm Tracy. I'm also from EDC and part of the Coordination Hub. And I just wanted to join because I actually don't know what process tracing is. And I'm really eager to find out about it. And so I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. And Terri, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. I'm Terri Akey, and I am a director at ORS Impact. I'm a member of the coordination hub as well. I'm the evaluation lead, the internal evaluation lead. And I am here today to talk about process tracing, and I'm hoping to, learn from you as well. I was telling Alyssa and Evangeline that I can certainly talk about process tracing. I'm not sure I have all the answers because it's pretty complex, especially when you apply it to these systems initiatives. So I'm hoping to learn from others as well, too, as well as talk about what my experience has been.
Great, thanks, Terri. And I see that I think Sarah Bolduc joined as well. Sarah, did you want to unmute and introduce yourself?
Phew, I made it. Phew. Sorry. I tried everything to log on and it was saying the meeting ID was invalid. So I'm so happy to be here. I actually joined last week to try and attend this meeting, but I guess I was a week early. I had the wrong time. So thank you for having me. I'm calling from Hawaii and happy to hear about this presentation. I heard it a few months ago. I heard about this a few months ago, and I think I'm the one who requested it. So I'm glad I made it. Hi, everyone I know. Well, that's nice.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And if I think that should be everyone, but if I missed anyone, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Thank you again for being here, and I will pass it over to Alyssa.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. So just wanted to put a few, not necessarily disclaimers, but setting expectations around this conversation. Basically, these Friday chats are really an informal and in some ways intimate gathering to just connect with one another, ask questions, and really learn from one another. Also an opportunity to share what's working, what may not be working, and lessons learned related to that, whether it's related to process tracing or in some other application of it. And also want to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers. We probably have more questions than answers, but we would hope to be able to facilitate and get responses, do a little more digging. And one thing that I like to always say is one of the best resources in the network are the network members themselves. So I kind of feel like this could be a very valuable peer learning opportunity. So with that, I just wanted to kind of put all of that out there. I'll pause to see if there are any questions or comments around that before I turn it over to Terri to talk about process tracing. Okay, we can jump right into the conversation then.
All right, so I wanted to just a little bit of level setting in terms of what process tracing is, and then we can kind of engage in conversation about it. And I'm going to define it and kind of talk about it generally, and then I'm going to talk about it in the context of a couple of projects, which can maybe help illustrate some of the challenges and benefits of it, because it's not a really very easy methodology to put into place and has some constraints to it. So to start out with, process tracing is a methodology that we use that's been used a lot in overseas and global evaluation world, and is now starting to make its way here in terms of it being a methodology that folks are finding value in for understanding anything from contribution to attribution to causality. So it sort of fits in that more trying to explain and understand what contributes to particular outcomes happening. One of the benefits of it, it's a design that does not require some of the constraints of, for example, randomized controlled trials or quasi-experiments. It tends to be very appropriate for more qualitative data collection or settings where you have multiple sources of data that you're bringing together into, try to understand what's happening. And it is also has a benefit of being able to be done with relatively small n sizes. So, for example, the collective impact study that someone referred to earlier that we did, where we used process tracing, we did process tracing on 8 sites. So you can see that there are some benefits there to really understand using smaller ends. And the reason that that is that the strength of process tracing lies within the ability to test out hypotheses within a case. So it's essentially a case study methodology that has the ability to be sort of brought up and looked across multiple cases. So oftentimes you'll see it happening when you have a multiple case study design, where you're really testing out the hypothesis in each of the specific cases, and then you're taking those results and you're saying, are there patterns across these hypotheses, across the contribution stories, et cetera, that can inform us about contribution more generally. So it does have that benefit of both being case specific, so that you could really tease out what's happening within a particular setting, and the opportunity to look across settings as well. The logic of process tracing is fairly intuitive and simple. It starts with determining what your theory is. And in the instances where we've used it, the first step has been to create an initiative level theory of change that sort of represents how we think change happens in general, across independent of site or characteristics on the ground or that sort of thing. What's the kind of global way that we think change happens? And you can see here for the CI study on this slide, we have a very simple change model, that collective impact leads to early changes in people and organizations, which then lead to systems changes, which could be things like policy, resources, those sorts of things at the systems level, creating on-ramps, reducing barriers, that sort of thing, that then lead to population change. So it's a pretty simple high-level model. And this is the foundation for the entire analysis. What you're trying to do is create a theory that allows you to create hypotheses to test. We then go and whatever number of sites that we have, or cases, we would then translate this model into what we call a localized theory of change for how this model, this kind of generic model, shows up in the particular case that you're talking about. So the way we practically did that for the collective impact study was we did interviews, or a set of interviews where we asked a lot of questions about the links between these buckets of activities and outcomes, and then we actually created a mini logic model or mini theory of change and worked with each case site to make sure that it represented how they saw this theory playing out in their particular context. And sometimes it would require modification right from this theory because it doesn't fit, which was all part of the process of sort of understanding what this looked like. Once we did those kind of localized theories of change, then there's this looking for data. And the data are specific to testing the links or the hypotheses that you generate. So you could have as many hypotheses for a case as you wanted. In the example of the collective impact study, we had some specific hypotheses we were interested in. We were interested in whether, the collective impact conditions, the presence of those, contributed both to the early changes more directly, but then what were the kind of indirect relationships to systems change or population change, and could we make any direct kind of conclusions about that? We also had some iterative hypotheses about how early changes and systems changes sort of work together and were kind of iterative and nonlinear. And then the last set of things that you have in process tracing is you have a set of what are called alternative hypotheses or alternative drivers. And the way that you set this up is you have what we call your research hypotheses or your evaluation hypotheses, which are the ones that are specific to the theory of change. And then you have alternative hypotheses, which could be hypotheses about other things in the system that are affecting the outcome. It could be, other initiatives. There could be a variety of things that are alternative drivers. It could be context that's happening in this community versus this community. And so you've got these two sets of hypotheses that you're really trying to kind of compare to each other. So that's all makes sense. One of the caveats to process tracing, though, and for this to work, is it's really, 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 really important to make sure that you can actually measure the outcome well that you're trying to explain contribution to. In the CI study, we were able to find sites that had demonstrated population change. So there was a whole phase of that work in terms of selecting the sites for which we would do deeper process tracing to vet and verify that those population changes were real and that they were validly measured and that there was credibility around them, et cetera. So that was an important step. We did process tracing in another project where we were looking at museums and libraries and how they were working with their communities differently using asset-focused community development principles. And in the theory of change, the long-term outcome was changes in the community, communities being more included in what's happening with museums and libraries, community agendas being driven by, for community and library programming, lots of those kinds of things. The problem that we ran into, though, was that this was a 2-year project and those community changes were much longer term. And so we couldn't consistently measure those community changes in a way that allowed process tracing to be done very well. So it's really important for that outcome, that longer term outcome that you're looking for contribution towards is really strongly measured. To the degree that it's not, it's really hard to do this and really hard to make sense out of it. The other thing I think that's important in setting up these models is to be really clear about how the alternative drivers are different from your theory. Because that's the crux of the method, is to compare the evidence for those alternative drivers against the evidence for the contribution of your theory. And so you really want to make sure that those are really clearly laid out and distinct. The actual process of doing process tracing is not all that different than some of our analytical thinking that we usually do. We usually approach it as kind of an iterative process. We collect data, set up the theory based on the data. We vet that based on additional conversations. We collect more information after that about really, really digging in on those links and trying to understand from multiple stakeholders what those links look like. We have them prioritize which links, what things are most important, they think are most important to contributing to those outcomes. And that's kind of an iterative process. So what that data gets fed back into the model and you make refinements to the model. Until you feel like you've represented the story. The last stage of this, though, is the analyzing of the hypotheses themselves. And really what you're looking at for process tracing are two things. You're looking for, is this explanation or this hypothesis of something contributing to the outcome unique? I mean, it only it's not the same as anything else. And is it sufficient? So the uniqueness is about it being there and not being duplicated by anything else. It's shows up in the system and you can see it and you can see its relationship potentially, and it's a unique relationship. The sufficiency part of it is a little more tricky in that it is the evidence you have about this relationship sufficient to explain the outcome? So you are making two judgments, and if it's both necessary and sufficient to explain the outcome, that's like the gold standard. And that like never happens when you're doing systems change work, right? Because you can never really rule out all of those alternative hypotheses. The next best level, though, is for it to be sufficient, sufficient to explain at least part of the relationship. It's necessary. You always have to have it be necessary for it to have support for the hypothesis, but the sufficiency is less. There is evidence that it has some contribution or some relationship, but you can't rule out all of the other hypotheses, the alternative hypotheses. And that's usually what we're aiming for, is that bucket of, yes, we can, it's a unique relationship, it is important, and it's somewhat sufficient. We have evidence that it does play some role, even if we can't rule out the effects of everything else. And so then you are thinking about to what, so then we start to think more quantitatively. So what's that degree of relationship, right? To what degree, what percent of that is really about my intervention and what percent of that is alternative drivers? And that's where it gets a little stickier. And you probably want to think about setting up some benchmarks or rubrics or something that would help you within your own context understand what would be meaningful in that way. So I will stop right there, and that was a lot, but I wanted to just kind of give a broad overview of it, and I'm happy to dig into any of the examples, talk a little bit more about benefits and challenges or any of that. So I'll stop now.
Thanks, Terri. I don't know if you saw in the chat kind of earlier when you had talked about the localized theories of change. Sarah Bolduc had added to the chat around do the case-specific theories of change change the broader theory of change? And Sarah, feel free to weigh in and clarify your question on that.
Just a little clarification about like you said, the localized theories. As you refine, do you change the main model as well, or just the theories get refined?
It depends. It depends on whether the purpose is to actually illuminate the enacted theories of change, or if it's to confirm your theory, right? So if it's confirmatory, the kind of interpretation and implications are about the degree to which your theory doesn't fit the data. And you stop there, right? So it's more like traditional hypothesis testing. Yes, it's significant. No, it's not. Significant and meaningful. No, it's not. But if it's about trying to unearth what the enacted theory of change is, which is, when I say enacted theory of change, I mean what actually happens on the ground when you implement these programs and what works, then yes, there would be a step. You could have the step of coming back and revising the theory of change overall. And we did that with the museum and library study. We actually came back and said, this theory of change does not seem to be working in these ways. And we worked with the client to change the theory of change so that it represented the actual reality of on the ground for museums and libraries. So it's, it's a tool that's flexible for multiple purposes, but just you have to think about how you're framing and what you're trying to accomplish from it. Does that help, Sarah?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions based or comments even based on the broad brush overview that Terri provided?
Yes. This is Cindy. Can you?
Cindy is.
Okay. I was going to ask about an example of what kind of data like would be, Terri, something that doesn't match the model. Would it be interview data or observation data? What could you give an example of exactly what kind of data would reveal that the evidence is not showing alignment?
Yeah, so I can talk, I can talk a little bit about the process of how we did it for the collective impact study and for the museum study. So there, we relied on a variety of data. So we did interviews, we did document review, we did surveys, we did focus groups, and then with the actual folks in the initiatives, and then we also did, this was the library and museum one. They had a technical assistance provider who was helping them build capacity in asset-focused community development. So we also did interviews and surveys with them about the degree to which they saw these museums and libraries meeting the goals on achieving the outcomes on the theory of change. So that set of data set up the localized theory of change. And then we went back and collected additional data once we did the theory of change. We did focus groups, structured focus groups, or facilitated dialogues, which were actually a way of walking people through the theory of change, different groups of stakeholders, and asking for additional evidence about those links or adding additional outcomes or additional activities and building it that way. And then after that process of collecting that facilitated dialogue information, for the collective impact study, we did that from 4 or 5 stakeholder groups. The museum one, we did it from 3 different groups. And those were people involved in the initiative, partners, like institutional partners related to those folks, and then community members. So it is a method that can be iterative and continue to be refined as you collect additional sources of data. But as you can imagine, that becomes very time and resource intensive at some point. So that's another consideration, I think, to think about.
This is Mary. I'm just wondering how you look at the data, the interviews or the documents and so forth. So are you looking for people's attributions as to what is working or not working, or explaining their understanding of systems?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways. So the interview protocols would be structured around the theory of change. So for example, in the collective impact one, if you looked at the simple theory of change, we would go back, we would do backward mapping in the interview. So we would say, help us understand what outcomes you're seeing. What population outcomes are you seeing? What are the goals that you're trying to achieve? To what degree is that happening? How are you measuring that? What does that look like? And then we would back up and say, okay, here are systems changes. And all of this the iterated part of the data is really important, because you have to set up, you have to know enough to go into these interviews to be able to ask these questions in a way that will yield good data. So we did a lot of background work, like looking at people's documentation and how they, they're kind of public documents about the initiatives. But then we would say, here's the systems changes that we saw. So for example, you have a really strong policy and advocacy strategy that's leading to trying to influence legislators. You have and trying to increase funding. You have a real strong strategy for trying to create cross-sector collaboration and getting some systems change outcomes around that. Can you talk to us about that? Tell us what those look like. Give us examples. And then you say, okay, which of those systems changes then could you say connected to these population changes? And then you just keep going backwards through the model in the interview process. So the interviews and facilitated dialogues are very much structured around the theory of change and kind of in a backward mapping kind of way.
Great, thank you.
Sarah, I'm seeing your comment as well. Is that also I should say your question, Sarah Bulldog, in the chat around asking about links? Sounds similar, but I want to see if there was more to that you wanted to ask about specifically.
I think in her answer to giving examples is really helpful. You make it sound like this is easy, but I'm totally overwhelmed. So.
No, it's not easy. I think it's, the process part, I think laying out the process part is fairly straightforward. I think there's a kind of a sequence of steps that can be expanded or contracted based on the level of resource or the level at which you want to go into. It's the analysis of it that's challenging. It's the evaluating the strength of evidence and then making those comparisons to the alternative drivers, which feels often more subjective than I would like it to be. And we've addressed that in a couple of ways. One, we've created rubrics where we have very specific criteria about the strength that include the strength of evidence and just like the number of instances we've seen of this, or you can create rubrics that allow you to sort of standardize across those different things. But yeah, the analytic part is trickier and takes a lot of time, and I think it can be done with one person or so, but we've really benefited from having a team approach to it. I'd be curious, has anyone else ever done something like process tracing? Has anybody experimented with it? And if they have any insights from you all?
This is John. Just I haven't done process tracing as you described, but a lot of what you described to me sounds a lot like how I learned qualitative research methodology in education, kind of building models, you know, generating evidence to understand whether the model is work, is there or not, and having explanatory power to it. Um, it may be differ in some of the data that you're looking at, and maybe some of the analytics, but yeah, very kind of, just kind of having flashbacks to grad school right now. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that's right. I think it is a really strong attempt to duplicate the sort of hypothesis testing process. I often talk about it as the Sherlock Holmes method, right? Because what you're doing is collecting data and both sort of building theory and testing theory at the same time to try to understand what that story is. So it's often like detective work in that way. But yeah, it is that scientific process of hypothesis testing for sure, and model building.
One question, I don't know if it's a concern that you face, but it just, do you sometimes, I guess I'm a little concerned if you're, kind of, are you leading the witness a little bit in some of your questions? If you're only asking relative to the model, that here's what we're expecting to see, do you see it? And that can kind of be some, placing the thoughts sometimes in but I don't know, it was just a thought I had. I was wondering if that ever, is that's something you guys deal with?
Yeah, and I think what's built into the methodology is this idea of alternative drivers. So you would do the same thing with the alternative drivers component. You would say, I see in your work you have this kind of policy initiative going on at the state level around literacy, for example, that's not directly tied to the work that you're doing, or it might be that there's a collective impact initiative that's working on this thing. And your program just happens to be embedded in that. But so it also requires very careful thinking through and assessing those alternative hypotheses too, and asking people about those things. And then the art of it, I think, is to then at the end say, given the weight of evidence about my theory hypotheses and the weight of evidence about alternative hypotheses, how comfortable am I at saying my program contributed to, this set of outcomes versus something else. So a lot of the rigor is in the actual analytic process of this is why it could go on forever, because it's really about, you collect data, you test that hypothesis, you may refine that hypothesis, or you may want to strengthen the evidence on that hypothesis, so you collect a little more data, right? And you do this process, and you do that for both sets of hypotheses until you feel comfortable, or until you are like, I'm done through these 3 phases and that's all we can do. So here's what we can say. Yeah.
Thanks.
I see the logic of this is very similar to like the quantitative methods, right? You do all the steps and you collect all the data, but the analysis of is the part, the analysis has to be strong. The internal logic of the analysis has to be strong. And you have to make that conceptual case as well, not just the quantitative case.
This is Mary again. This is very interesting because you're looking at how people are thinking, and you're examining I guess the number of times that certain types of thinking occurs, but you're not doing anything as simplistic as analyzing the frequency of certain vocabulary words or anything like that. Is that correct?
I have not done that. I would assume that you could. I would think that this is, the process tracing kind of, there's a whole kind of quantitative arm of process tracing that uses Boolean algebra to, which I can't tell you anything about other than I've read about it. But so there is some quantitative applications of this, I think, that can be used. I don't know. I have not done them. We've used it as a way to really strengthen our qualitative data and being able to tell a contribution story, because most of the work that we do is in systems change, and you can't measure this, like you can't measure some of the ways we think about measuring change over time don't apply, right? Because they're emergent and dynamic, and you can't capture them, you know, like in a standard measurement like you might in some other setting. But yeah, I can probably find a resource and send to Evangeline and Alyssa if folks are interested in that more quantitative side. But
actually, I think that this approach is the one that we would like to know more about. You know, how because this is so important in terms of understanding how people think about things, and so I'd be interested in how you would describe how this method is expanding in its use around the country or among evaluators, different evaluators, and so forth. What do you think?
You know, I think when we first did this in the collective impact study, which was in 2017-18, it was brand new. It was in our country. I mean, it had been being used in more humanitarian development work globally, you know, to try to understand how particular interventions or things were affecting outcomes, you know, at that kind of in that space. And it wasn't, we did not find a lot of examples where it was used in the United States. So I think at that point in time, it was fairly new. I think since then, there has been a lot more movement around these more qualitative rigor, conversation around qualitative rigor. And so you have things like process tracing, which has gained a lot of traction. I think, you know, I actually, the collective impact study has spurred a lot of conversations with folks about how process tracing could be used in other ways, because it's been very widely disseminated and sort of as an example out there about how to do it. But there are also other methodologies that are sort of coming to the forefront too, things like qualitative comparative analysis, where you actually are trying to take qualitative data and make it more you know, quantify it in some ways, and then look at the patterns among whether things, you know, it's kind of more set theory. So it's either there or it's not, and looking at the patterns among all those different sets. So I think there is this movement to be more rigorous in our qualitative approaches, especially when we're talking about attribution and contribution. So yeah.
Thank you.
So the one thing I did not talk about is, you know, that one of the benefits of this is that you can use this for a single case. So you could just have one setting where you're looking at this and use it as a single case to try to understand contribution and causality within your single particular setting, or you could look at it across multiple cases. And we often use it as a multiple case design methodology, because we're interested in both highlighting what's happening at the local level and all the different ways in which a particular theory of change could play out and look different, and all those flavors at the local level and describing that. But we're also interested in lifting up patterns, similar patterns that we see emerge across those multiple cases. So one of the things I really like about it is it has that kind of dual level that's helpful, you know, for one or both of them, that can really help you gain some understanding at different levels. So.
How do you present this data?
So that's a really good question. we have done it in a number of ways. We have actually described it more qualitatively. When we did the collective impact study, we actually had the rubric scores that we could actually show, like the number of collective impact initiatives that had strong evidence that a common agenda was connected to collaborative systems change, right? You know, if we were testing that hypothesis across 8 different settings, you know, we might have 6 out of 8. You know, so you can do it in a quantitative way as well, and show sort of the number of sites for the multiple case example, the number of hypotheses, the number of cases that that hypothesis is true for or not. It kind of gives you a sense of that. And we actually presented that on the actual theory of change, where we put the theory of change, we put these sort of weights, you know, in terms of the being defined as the number of sites that had that hypothesis as showing up as, you know, at least in that 3rd level of sufficient, partly sufficient. And then there's like, you can kind of blow that out. What does that look like? And we would then describe sort of the variation in those links, what that looked like more qualitatively, or using our rubric scores. Or if we had survey scores, we might break it out. So we have, you know, three sites that really have these characteristics, 3 sites that have these characteristics. What does that look? What are the differences then? It then becomes a categorization for looking at other data to kind of understand differences and similarities. But yeah, we used to use the theory of change often to just you know, present the kind of weighting of the hypotheses.
I'm curious, Terri, if you could speak to instances or circumstances where you might think process tracing may be a good idea, but like I'm hearing, for example, the analysis is quite complicated, or so maybe staffing might be one consideration, but also if you're thinking about the initiative itself, like whether or not it's a good match in terms of like, think about if it's the right tool. If you're looking in your toolkit, is this the right tool that you want to apply in this scenario?
Yeah, I think the 2 things that are really important, one is that you have to have a very clearly defined and validated outcome measure, or be able to measure that, you know, in a valid way for each of your cases. If you don't have that, then there's no process tracing, right? And in the museum and library study that I talked about, we actually moved away from process tracing because we could not get a consistent measure on that community impact. So we said, well, that's not going to work. So we'll go back to a more qualitative, thematic, you know, maybe more trying to understand contribution just from a more qualitative perspective. So that's important. I think you have to be able to collect data that allows you to test the links. So if it's impossible for you to actually collect not just the data of this outcome and this outcome, you know, separately, but something, you have to be able to make that connection and collect that data explicitly around that connection. So, you know, for the museum and library study, we also had that challenge of there was so much variation in the capacity that these museums and libraries brought to the program. It was really hard to disentangle the alternative hypotheses, because we had museums and libraries that were really, really, really well equipped to do different kind of community engagement work, and we had museums and libraries that had no idea what to do. And it was really hard for those ones that were highly ready and had lots of things in place to really unpack what the impact the intervention had, what impact the program of capacity building and support had for those, because it looked really different. You know, essentially it came down to they were able to do things faster and better and more because they had more money. And they might have learned some things on the margin that helped them kind of refine, but in terms of wholesale change, you didn't see that. So I think it works better when you have to have some variation and diversity, but if you have too much, it's hard to make those kind of end of analysis judgments about the contribution. And of course, then money and resources, right? Because it is time intensive. And you have to weigh that with, if I can only do a little bit, is that really gonna get me, is that really gonna be credible and rigorous enough to be worth the effort? So you have to weigh those things, I think.
Exactly. It's expensive, but it's also, you said it earlier, that it's sort of like justifying the rigor of qualitative analysis, and it's, you know, in a sense, in the name, you get the word process, but it's kind of not taking into account the process. It's still focused on the end to me. Like it's missing that richness of the qualitative side, I feel. And then it's
what, yeah, I think it can. You know, the way that we have applied it is we've used it as the frame for understanding whether contribution is happening or not, and what those contribution patterns look like, and then using those results from the contribution analysis to help us unpack our qualitative data in different ways. And so we are able to take advantage of that richness of the qualitative data in sort of understanding, you know, this set of cases have these characteristics of contribution. Here's what they have, what characteristics they have on everything else, right? And unpacking their different stories and the different richness of that data and comparing it to the other set, right, who have a different contribution pattern. So in some ways it can, if you just stopped at the classification of contribution, you might lose that richness, but it can also be a tool that can then allow you to go back into your data and analyze your qualitative data using a slightly different framework or contribution framework.
I see this as being a very beautiful way. It could be used to present data to stakeholders with graphics and with sort of like a dynamic. I see colors. I see potential for really making the participants understand where they're fitting in and where everyone around them is fitting in. I think it can be really interesting graphically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we actually did a kind of a modified version of this with, it wasn't a full process tracing, but we used some of the principles to help one of our clients. They had a theory of influence for policy and advocacy, and they had a portfolio of 40 grantees. And we actually did the first steps of this, where we actually did the translation into local theories of change and let the grantees sort of trace their path onto the larger theory of influence. And it was really fascinating because you could see that really graphically where different grantees were playing different roles in the theory of change or the theory of influence, right? You know, you might have grassroots folks who are really working on this part of the one part of the theory of influence, and you might have these large government advocates working on a different part of the theory of influence. And it was really helpful for the client to see that and identify gaps in their portfolio in terms of being able to play out that entire theory of influence, right? That they were really heavily invested in a couple or three parts of it, but they were missing from another part. So there are parts of it you could pull and use in other settings as well, you know, not use the whole methodology, but some of it could be useful in other applications.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry for hijacking and asking so many questions, but could you repeat the three, was it three? It was unique, necessary?
Yeah, unique / necessary are the same thing, kind of, and that's what's really kind of challenging. I struggle to sort of, the unique / necessary is it's something that is there by itself and it's necessary for it to be there for the outcome to happen. It doesn't mean it caused it, but it's sort of like it has to be there for the outcome to happen, and it's unique from other things in the system. So that's the first criteria, is you have to establish that it is unique and that it is necessary. The sufficiency is more about the quality or the strength of that relationship. And it's sort of like, yes, you've identified that there is a co-occurrence of these things that's necessary and unique, which is really about co-occurrence. And the sufficiency is about to what degree is that relationship sufficient to explain the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And I can share some resources that do a whole lot better job than I do at sort of explaining how you look at the kind of 2x2 grid of those things. You know, necessary versus not necessary, unique versus not necessary, unique, and sufficient versus not sufficient. But I'll share that with Alyssa and Evangeline, and we can post those resources.
That would be very helpful. So this method is a wonderful method just to use in conversation with your various stakeholders at various levels too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, it really helps articulate and get clear around their theory of action and their theory of change, right? Which I think is often a challenge for our clients, is that they have ideas about what they want to accomplish and they have ideas about what they want to do and haven't really thought through that sort of black box in the middle, right? About how we actually think these activities are going to get us to the outcome. So it really does open up those kinds of conversations really well to help them unpack what it really means. What are their assumptions about change? How do they see these strategies linking? Does that really make sense, right? You know, so you can use it to test out in more of an R&D, right, or development perspective, right, of testing hypotheses that when you're at the beginning trying to develop it, as well as confirmatory at the end. So it has some. One of the things I like about it is that it's flexible in that way.
Yeah. It's very exciting. I think we might need to get back in touch with you to get more in depth about how you do it.
I'm not sure how adept I am. It's been a lot of trial by fire. And I would say that it worked really well in the collective impact study, and in the museum and library study that I just talked about, it was definitely a learning experience of why it wouldn't work. So, and I'm not sure I would have gotten that from just, you know, learning about it from somebody. It was really more just digging in and testing out the assumptions of the approach in both of those settings and sort of understanding what worked and what didn't.
Right, right.
So we are just about at time. I feel like this has been a really rich conversation. Oh, thank you for reminding me of these upcoming activities. First, thanks, Terri, for contributing to this conversation. I made a note of a couple of things to follow up on, and we'll also be posting a summary. We mentioned earlier summary, just so folks can kind of dig into this a bit more at their own, their own time. Because it is, you think about evaluation as a practice, it's something that you have to continually refine. So I'll stop here and let Evangeline talk briefly about some upcoming activities.
Sure. Thanks, Alyssa, and thanks, Terri. That was really, I felt like I learned so much. And thank you all for joining and, even asking your questions. Like Alyssa mentioned, and what I mentioned before is we will kind of have like a short summary, and we'll also share, Terri mentioned that she'll share some of the resources. So we will be posting that in the online community. So keep an eye out for that. But look out for some of these upcoming activities. Some of you are already, I know, Sarah, you're a very active member of the evaluation affinity group, so you know when the coffee and conversations are. But coffee and conversations are a great way to have some of these more intimate, in-depth conversations. So I would encourage you to join those. We do have a great webinar lined up on December 3rd, and we have 3 very good presenters. So if you haven't already RSVP'd, please do RSVP and join the webinar on December 3rd, and it's on embedding sustainable equity-centered practices. The other, if you haven't already seen, we do have a new Coordination Hub research brief, which actually maps the common collaborative change models. It's again available in the online community. Please, review it and tell us what you think, share your thoughts about it. And keep checking our events calendar. Please use the discussion forum to ask your questions and connect with one another. Thank you once again, Terri. This was really such a great conversation to have. And thank you, Sarah and Mary, for staying. And it looks like you both benefited, but I know that we did as well. And we look forward to continuing the conversation in the online community. So happy weekend, everybody. I hope you have a restful weekend, and thanks for joining.
Thank you.
You all
Thanks,
soon.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.